Hey everyone, welcome back. So today I thought we'd do something a little bit different and we would describe and rank pretty much every game in the TMNT Cowabunga collection. Now last week we finally got to play Shredder's Revenge and oh my god, if nothing else comes out that surprises me, I think I just got my game of the year. And maybe the one thing that playing that game has done is it's made me want even more turtles. And although I do pretty much have a way to play each one of the games on the Cowabunga collection, either through emulation or just because I own the retro games, I really just can't wait to experience it in handheld mode on my Nintendo Switch. Now, although I think most people know the big titles from the collection, there are a couple of hidden gems here, and I really want to take the time to point them out, and I thought that ranking all the games would be one of the best ways to do so. Now do keep in mind that this is my personal ranking of each game, because I've pretty much played all these games as they came out over the years. And I would like to mention, wait till everything is placed before you judge where I place a game to another, because I really think that once you see it all together, it really does make sense, each one of the rankings. But at the same time, if you disagree, I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments down below what you would have changed in these rankings. Now we're not going to waste any more time and jump straight into it. Just remember, one of the best ways to help support the channel, just hit that like button. So I thought we'd start with the original Turtles game from the NES. I think most people that played the Ninja Turtles on a console, this was probably their first experience if they grew up in that period of time. And unfortunately for a lot of people, it wasn't the best experience overall. Now, I've got to say, however, with time, as time has gone by and I've gotten to playing this game as an adult, it is way better than a lot of people make it out to be. The only problem I think primarily with this game is they really chose the wrong style of gameplay for the target audience at the moment this game released. Because back when this game released, the target audience were very young kids that played the NES, not adults with 20 age of nostalgia behind them. And unfortunately, the game was just too darn difficult for a kid to get a grasp of, and unfortunately that's why a lot of people have really bad memories of this game. And most of the deaths were cheap deaths, like a jump that you could only make like 10% of the time as a kid and stuff like that. But overall, it's not as bad as everyone says. It's not the worst turtle game on this list in my opinion, and I'm going to be placing it as a C tier game. Because nonetheless, as an adult, if you look into the game and you understand it, you can end up enjoying it. So since we're on the topic of the NES, let's right away look at the other game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game. Now, this is a game, personally, I have extremely fond memories of. I played it all the time. We rented it at the video store with my friends. We played it constantly. However, at the same time, looking at this game objectively, it was the best turtle game on the console version at the time it came out, but it does have some issues. The hitboxes were wonky. The level designs weren't the best, especially once we got the later entries in the turtle genre. And on top of it, the game was just too darn hard yet again for its target audience. I mean, this was based off an arcade game that you could just keep feeding quarters into, and you could have as many continues as you had quarters. However, this one gave you a set limit of lives and continues to finish the game. And I think most of us, as children, probably didn't end up finishing it, or maybe finished it one time out of 30 plays. Overall, however, it is nonetheless the game that pioneered the new direction for the Turtles franchise. It was a very solid entry, which is why I'm giving it a B tier here. Now, don't worry, everything's going to make sense in a few minutes, like I said, when we see everything placed together. Now let's finish up the standard NES titles. And this third game, Manhattan Project, is pretty much why the arcade game wound up in B tier. The reason why is that Manhattan Project took everything that the arcade game did and refined it. Better level designs, better enemy designs, better hitboxes. The animations were pretty similar, but other than that, it took everything that Turtles the arcade game started and it refined it. And unfortunately, I think less people have played this game than the arcade game. But I'm telling you right away, for me, Manhattan Project is an S tier game. Why? Because it's on the NES. It was limited by the system it was on, but nonetheless, it is the best iteration of a Turtles game on the NES. And in my opinion, if you haven't played the Manhattan Project and you're only going to play one of the NES games, make it this game. So now that we're done the mainline NES titles, let's move on to the Game Boy. And the first one is Fall of the Foot Clan. Now, Fall of the Foot Clan, I'm going to say it, in my opinion, was a better Turtles entry than the original NES title. Why? Because it was better geared towards its target audience. It is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where basically there's no third dimension, like it's only left to right. But at the same time, it really did give a better overall experience for a young player playing the Turtles franchise for the first time. And personally, as a kid, I had way more fun playing Fall of the Foot Clan than I did the original Turtles game. And yes, that nostalgia continued over the years. The only thing I'm going to say, the game is fairly short. Once you get used to it, you can finish it in about 45 minutes. But nonetheless, as a Turtles game, I just think it was a better overall representation than the original NES title. And considering that it's on the Game Boy, I'm putting it in B tier. Now, it's going to seem odd having this next to the arcade game, but think of the fact that these are two systems with way different power levels, and that's why I'm placing them both in B tier, because this is a B tier for the Game Boy, this is a B tier for the NES. Now, our next game is going to be Back to the Sewers. Back to the Sewers is a really weird one. Why? Because graphically, it's better than Fall of the Foot Clan. Like, the turtles look more like turtles in this game than Fall of the Foot Clan. But in my opinion, other than that, everything feels weirder than Fall of the Foot Clan. And this is probably the Turtles game with the worst hitboxes of all the Turtle games. They basically tried to bridge the gap between the arcade game and the Game Boy games, where at sometimes you have like this fake third dimension, other times you're 2D side-scrolling, and I'll be honest with you, it just feels off to me. Out of all the Turtle games in this collection, this is my least favorite one, and that's why I'm going to be placing this one in the D tier, because I do think that although I like what they tried to do, it wasn't much of a success because of the limitations of the system that they had, and they should have rather stuck with the 2 dimensions, and you'll see because they sort of did that in the next entry. And overall, Back to the Sewers, in my opinion, is the weakest Turtle game in the whole collection. So that brings us to the third entry, Turtles 3 Radical Rescue on the Game Boy. Now this is a game, once again, I think few people have played. I think out of all the games on the Game Boy, probably the fewest people have played Radical Rescue. And that is very sad, because it was a late title on the Game Boy life cycle. But Turtles 3 Radical Rescue, for those of you who don't know, is Turtles in a Metroidvania format. Yes, I said it. Turtles has a Metroidvania game, and it is on the Game Boy. And you know what? It's actually pretty good. You start out as one turtle, you have to save each one of your brothers will have different abilities, and so forth. But basically, Turtles did Metroidvania before the whole Metroidvania thing was really a thing. Like, Metroid existed, Castlevania existed, but the whole Metroidvania genre wasn't yet developed, and the Turtles already did it. And they actually did it pretty well, pretty fun, especially considering the limitations of the Game Boy. And that's why Radical Rescue is going to be an S tier game. This, in my opinion, is the biggest hidden gem in the whole Cowabunga collection. And personally, when I get my hands on this collection, this is the first game I'm going to replay, because the only time I managed to play this game is through emulation, and I'm still hunting for a cartridge today. So now we're gonna get to the fighter games. We're gonna keep the best for last, okay? We're gonna keep the Super Nintendo games and the arcade games for last. We're gonna start with the 3 TMNT Tournament Fighters. Now, we're gonna start with the Genesis one, okay? The Genesis one, I've said this before, I grew up as a Genesis kid. I loved my Genesis. However, personally, out of the 3 fighting games, I think that the Genesis one was the worst representation of the Turtles given the power of the system it was on. So a lot of people will say it's the NES version, and I won't argue with them that if you line up the 3 games each against each other on the same console, obviously the NES version would be the weakest one. But if we look at the power that the Genesis had, the other Tournament Fighter games that were available on the Genesis, and we line up Turtles Tournament Fighters against it, it had the weakest roster in my opinion. Like, Shredder wasn't there. A lot of the bosses were like these no-name characters. I'm saying no-name, just characters we didn't see that often, and the big guys weren't there. Also, the controls are probably the worst of the 3 fighting games in my opinion, given the fact that the Sega Genesis had 3 buttons and not only 2, and actually had a 6-button controller, and they only used 2 buttons for attacks and a 3rd button for the taunt. Why? Not too sure still today. But in my opinion, I know a lot of people maybe love this Tournament Fighter, but because of how weak it was compared to what the system could have probably pulled off, I'm putting it in C tier. The only thing I'm going to say is I did like the darker tone to the cel-shaded graphics in the Genesis version. Although I think the graphics overall are cleaner in the Super Nintendo version that we're going to get to in a few seconds, I did like the grittier, darker graphics that they used for the Genesis one. So I would love a blend of the 2 graphics at one point. But overall, unfortunately, in my opinion, Genesis Fighter, C tier. So now let's do Tournament Fighters on the NES. Now, Tournament Fighters on the NES is a special case. Why? Try to name one other Tournament Fighter on the NES. You might manage to find like one title here or there, but they are extremely rare. As I said earlier, the Genesis title was so weak in my opinion because of the other games on the system. I mean, you had Primal Rage, you had Street Fighter 2, you had so many other tournament fighters that were superior to Turtles Tournament Fighters that basically, that's why it ended up where it is. However, on the NES, this is probably the best tournament fighter available on the NES. At the same time, it was very limited by the system. The roster, however, is almost as big as the roster on the Genesis, 7 characters. And you know what? Overall, I find the roster is stronger on the NES version than it was on the Genesis. Now, that being said, it's not a perfect game. It doesn't deserve an A tier, but in my opinion, it definitely deserves a B tier. Because if you get a couple of people together, you can have some fun times on the NES because it's on such a limited system and it's actually managed to do a full tournament fighter style. So we only have one tournament fighter left, the SNES version. And you can probably tell by the way I described the other 2, this is my favorite entry in the series. It has the best roster. It has unlockable characters. The animations are way better. The whole control scheme is way better than the other 2 entries. It uses all 4 buttons of the Super Nintendo. And you know what? It can actually go head-to-head with some of the other fighting franchises. I'm not going to say it's as good as something like Street Fighter 2 on the SNES, but it can actually go head-to-head, and you can actually make an argument to why you would want to play this instead of some of those other franchises. That being said, it's still not an S tier. To be an S tier, this would have to be able to compete directly with something like Street Fighter 2, but I definitely think it's an A tier fighting game. In my opinion, if you're going to get the collection and you're not going to play each one of the fighting games, start with the SNES version. It's the best overall experience, and there's actually a competitive scene till today that is active for the SNES version. There are for the other 2 versions, but the biggest active community is definitely on the SNES version. So now we get to probably the big boys of the collection, and this is maybe where people are going to disagree with me, but I think it's going to be maybe one category up or down for most titles. Let's start with the big boy, Turtles in Time SNES. Look, in my opinion, till Shredder's Revenge, this was the best iteration of a Turtles beat 'em up that we had, arcade version included and console version included. So it's probably going to give you a hint of where I'm going to be placing Turtles in Time on the arcade. People are going to make arguments that the arcade version is better. Graphically, the 2 games are very close. The biggest advantage to the arcade version is you can play up to 4 players at once. And I have to give that to them. On the SNES version, it's only 2 players. However, I do think that the levels are better on the SNES because we have levels that aren't in the arcade version. This one actually has Shredder as a final boss, which is just feels right for a Turtles game. Overall, I do think that the best iteration of Turtles in Time is not the arcade version, it is the SNES version for the overall experience. The only reason why someone would place, in my opinion, the arcade version above is someone who insists to play with more than 2 players. Then I gotta give it to them. If that is your main reason why you play Turtles in Time, the arcade version for you is going to be superior. But to me, this is the very definition of an S-tier game in the Turtles franchise. So since we sort of talked about the subject, let's talk about the arcade game. Same thing. I'm placing it A tier. I'm not going to waste too much time because I sort of talked about both titles at once. But basically, this is Turtles in Time. The bosses are a little weaker. You don't have Slash, you don't have Shredder, as I said earlier. However, you can play 4 players. So some people might place this one in S tier as well. I'm placing it in A tier. Look, it's an excellent game. Just, to me, it was outdone by its console version, which is why I'm placing it in A tier just underneath. Next, we move on to the arcade version of the original Turtles game. Now, I know we talked about the NES version way before, but that's why I placed the NES version in the B tier. Because the arcade version is going to be, for me, the A tier game. And I just didn't feel right both having these games in A tier, you understand? So that's why I put the NES version in B tier. Because opposite to Turtles in Time, the arcade original was a better version than the console version, given the power disparity between the two systems. The arcade version had better graphics, the hitboxes were more consistent, the levels were similar, but obviously due to graphical power were better representations. Overall, the arcade Turtles game was a better version of the console version, which is the opposite of what happened for Turtles in Time. So that's why I'm placing this one in A tier. And now, finally on our list, we have Hyperstone Heist. Now this one probably is going to be the biggest argument, is some people basically are going to, alternate this and Turtles in Time, or going to want this, up with Turtles in Time. I'm going to start out by telling you where I'm placing it. I'm placing it in A tier. And I said earlier, that's not because I'm a Nintendo kid. I was a Genesis kid. But Hyperstone Heist and Turtles in Time, overall, they're almost reskins of the same game, okay? With different levels, different bosses, different, a different overall storyline. But still, I do have to admit that Turtles in Time did it just slightly better. The level designs were slightly superior. The balance in the game was slightly better. Hyperstone Heist came very close, but wasn't quite exactly as good of an experience, in my opinion, as Turtles in Time, and that comes from a Genesis fan. So it's not about, rose-colored glasses and everything on the SNES is going to beat the Genesis. Obviously not. I have many iterations of games that I prefer on the Genesis to the SNES. And I would say probably where it hit me the most was the soundtrack. The soundtrack to Turtles in Time sounded so much better on the SNES than the Genesis. I'm going to get some people angry there, but to me, that was my overall feeling. Still an excellent game, but it is an A tier because I just won't place it in the same tier as Turtles in Time. So there we have my tier list for all the Turtle games in the Cowabunga collection. In the S tier, we have Manhattan Project, Radical Rescue, and Turtles in Time. A tier, we have the SNES Tournament Fighter, we have Turtles in Time, the arcade game, we have the original Turtles arcade game, and we have Hyperstone Heist. In C tier, we have the Genesis Fighter, and we have the NES original title. And D tier, we have Back to the Sewers. To me, there was no necessity to put an E tier or an F tier. To me, even the worst Turtles game was still a D tier. You can still have fun playing Back to the Sewers. It's just going to be the weakest experience overall for the whole collection. So as I said earlier, let me know what you think of my tier list. If you disagree with any of it, let me know where you would have placed the games differently. I just ask, be respectful, with no reason to get angry. We're just talking, we're just having fun. And overall, I made this tier list because I'm such a huge fan of the Turtles, and now, as I said, with Shredder's Revenge behind us, I'm already looking towards the Cowabunga collection to be able to replay some of these excellent games on my Nintendo Switch. And by the way, on the way out, don't forget, if you did like the content, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and click on the notification bell so you know when all my future content comes out. And as usual, I'll see you in my next video.